She claimed me on the worn stone floor of the oldest cathedral in the city, beneath 10,000 of my own flowers, in front of 300 of the most important guests the Harcourt name could assemble, at the altar of her own wedding to another woman, with the vows already begun. Aveline Harcourt, the coldest heir of the coldest house in the country, the alpha who 3 years before had let her family sign her into a marriage I was not allowed to stop, turned at the altar in front of her bride and her grandmother, and the whole staring nave, walked back down the aisle I had spent 3 nights dressing in white roses, and stopped in front of the working girl who had built her wedding, the florist nobody had looked at twice, because she had just seen, holding my hand at the end of that aisle, a 3-year-old with copper hair and her own gray eyes.
Hi everyone! Thank you for staying with me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Stay close, stay connected.
I'm going to tell you how a flower shop girl ended up being claimed at the altar of a wedding she was hired to decorate. But you have to let me go back, because nothing about that altar makes sense until you understand the 3 years of not telling the truth that came before it. If you want the uncensored, too hot for YouTube version of this story, the parts I cannot tell here, it is on my Patreon, link in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My name is Bryony Lowe and I work in flowers. Not the pretty part, not the part that gets photographed, not the bouquet in the bride's hands that everyone sighs at. I work the cold room and the buckets and the 4 a.m. market runs, with stems that cut and thorns that catch and water that never stops being freezing. And I build, out of things that are already dying the moment you cut them, the most beautiful single day of other people's lives. I am a florist. I am one of the people who turn an empty stone room into a held breath while you sleep, and slip out the trade door before you wake, so that you will believe the cathedral simply bloomed for you overnight. Most of the people who do my job do it with a recipe and a cooler and a steady hand, and they do it beautifully, and weddings happen because of them. I did it with all of that too. But I also did it with the other thing, the thing I have never been able to put on an invoice, the thing that made me, by 26, quietly the best pair of hands in the city, and just as quietly the easiest woman in it to throw away. I can read flowers. I do not know how else to say it so that it does not sound like a lie or a sweetness, and it is neither. Give me a bucket of cut stems an hour off the truck, and a cold room, and my 2 hands. And I can feel, somewhere behind my sternum, in a place that has no name, exactly what each flower is going to do. Not what the florist's chart says, not what the grower promised. Which rose will be wide and generous by Saturday, and which will blow open and drop on Friday night. Which peony is lying about how much it has left? Which spray of stephanotis will hold for the long walk down a warm aisle, and which will brown at the edges in an hour under the candles? The chart tells you the average. I feel the particular one in my hand. The truth of this stem on this day in this heat, a full day before it shows. They cannot teach this. They try, they cannot. You either feel the flower telling you the truth, or you do not. And I have felt it since I was a girl on a stool beside my grandmother, in a market stall, with my hands stinging from the cold buckets. And it had made me, by 26, quietly extraordinary, and just as quietly invisible, which in my experience are almost always the same woman. I want to show you the gift before I tell you what it cost, because otherwise it is only a claim. And I have spent my whole life refusing to be only a claim. Years ago, before any of this, I was a casual hand at a grand society wedding. Nobody. The girl they hired to carry buckets and sweep stems, invisible. The head florist, a famous name, the best in the city by reputation, had built an enormous arch over the top table out of garden roses, and it was beautiful. And I walked past it carrying a bucket, and I stopped, because I could feel it. I cannot tell you how. The room was warm, and the arch was perfect, and every single guest who would later sit beneath it saw a finished, flawless thing. And I felt, behind my sternum, the exact quiet wrongness of 100 roses that had all been cut a day too early and forced warm, Flowers that were going to blow open all at once, in the heat of a packed marquee, in the middle of the speeches, I told the head florist. He looked at me the way you look at a bucket girl with opinions, and he told me he had been doing this for 30 years and to mind my sweeping. And I stood there, invisible, in an agony of knowing, and I watched a thing I could have saved. And 2 hours later, in the warmth of 300 guests, the whole arch let go at once, petals coming down across the cake and the bride like a slow, soft snow of ruin, and nobody, not one person, ever knew that a nameless girl with a broom had felt it coming. That is the gift, and that is the curse. The same woman, the same hour. I am early, and I am invisible. And I learned a long time ago that being early is worth nothing at all, if you have made yourself too small to be believed when you say the thing is going to come apart. Remember that. It is the whole of what I had to unlearn. There was another time, and I tell you both because together they are the whole truth of what the gift is. A year after the arch, at a different wedding, I felt that a bride's bouquet, already tied, already blessed, already in the cooler, was wrong, that the lily of the valley at its heart had been forced and would be brown and stinking sweet by the time she reached the altar. And that time I did not stay quiet, because I had learned that much. I rebuilt it in 20 minutes with stems from my own bucket, on my own time, and said nothing to the famous name whose label was on the box. The bride walked down the aisle with a perfect bouquet and never knew it had been saved, and the famous name took the photograph and the praise and the next year's booking, and I swept the floor. I was early, and I was right, and I saved her day, and I was still invisible. And that is the lesson the world spent 26 years teaching me twice over. Being right is not the same as being believed, and being believed is not the same as being seen. And a poor girl with cold hands is allowed, at most, one of the three, on a good day by accident. My grandmother is the reason I can do it, and she is the reason you are going to believe the rest, so let me set her down properly. She raised me. My mother was a name on a card, and my grandmother was a pair of cracked hands over a cold bucket. So I had my grandmother, and she had sold flowers from the same corner stall for 40 years, in a city that does not exist anymore the way she knew it. And she could look at a flower the way you look at a person's face and know exactly what it was thinking. She had a pair of florist's shears, an old steel pair worn thin and bright at the pivot, and a length of faded green silk ribbon she tied every bunch with. And the first true memory I have of being myself is her folding my too small hand around the cold steel of those shears and teaching me the only thing I have ever truly believed. Flowers don't lie about what they're for, Bryony. A bloom always knows who it's for. She did not make a fuss of what I could do, the way I could put a hand over a bucket and know which stem would fail. She made it ordinary. You just listen early. I understand now that it was the kindest and most protective thing she could have done, because she had seen what the world does to a poor girl who is gifted out loud. When she died, I was 19, and the only things I took from her one cold room were those worn steel shears and that faded green ribbon. And I have not built a single wedding without them in my apron in 7 years. Remember the shears. They come back, the way the flowers always do. My grandmother sold flowers until her hands would not close around the shears anymore. And then she sat by the window of our one room and got smaller, the way market women do when you take the stall away from them. And I sat with her in the evenings, and we did not talk about dying. We talked about flowers. She would close her eyes and have me describe a bucket to her and tell me from her chair, from memory, from 40 years of listening, which stem would fail first. And she was nearly always right. The gift outliving the hands, the listening the last thing in her to go. The night before she died, she folded my fingers around the worn steel of the shears the way she had when I was small. And she did not make a speech, because she never made speeches. She just tied her green ribbon around my wrist and said, "A bloom always knows who it's for, Bryony. So do you." Then I had a pair of shears and a length of ribbon and a gift and a forwarding address for a mother and nobody else in the world. And I went out and built other people's beautiful days for whoever would pay the least, which is how the best pair of hands in the city ended up sweeping other people's stems and calling it getting by. So that is the shape of me when the Harcourt name first reached down into my small life. The best pair of hands in the city, and the cheapest, and the most disposable. A woman who could feel a flower fail a day early, and had spent her whole life learning that the feeling was worth nothing, unless someone with a name decided to spend their own credit on it. I had a tiny shop by then, 2 cold rooms and a window, built out of nothing and secondhand buckets. And I did the flowers the famous names took credit for, the great events where I came in the trade door at midnight and left before the guests, never once photographed beside my own work. I told myself I had made my peace with being early and invisible. I had not made my peace with anything. I had just gotten very, very good at looking like a woman who had. You should know what the work actually is, because the world only ever sees the finished aisle and never the 4 in the morning. My day started in the dark at the flower market, in a cold concrete hall under buzzing lights, walking the rows with my grandmother's eye, putting my hand over a bucket, and feeling which growers' roses were honest and which had been forced and dressed to lie, because a flower will lie to your eyes and never to your hands. Then the cold room, the stripping and the conditioning, the thorns and the freezing water, and the stems that open you up across the knuckles until your hands are a map of every wedding you have ever built. It is brutal, unglamorous, badly paid work, and it is the closest thing to prayer I have ever known, because for a few hours a day, alone with 1,000 dying things, I get to be the one person in the room who can hear what they are telling me. And I get to spend everything I have making them, for one single day, more beautiful than they had any right to be. I loved it the way you love a thing that is exactly as hard as you are. It was the one place the world could not make me small, because in the cold room, with the flowers, I was never invisible. They always saw me. They had no choice. They told me the truth and I told it back. I have to tell you about Aveline Harcourt, and I have to tell you about the way I knew her before I knew what she would cost me. Because everything that broke in me broke in the order it was built, and I built it 3 years ago, in the warm, low hours of a conservatory that does not belong to me anymore. I was the florist for a Harcourt garden party then, hired, invisible, on my knees in the borders at dawn before the guests came. And she found me there. Aveline Harcourt, the only heir of the oldest house in the country, a name that meant something the way a cathedral means something, more out of habit than belief by then. But still, she was an alpha the way winter is a fact, not loud about it, simply structural. The cold still point a whole house arranged itself around. Black hair she kept ruthlessly pinned, dark clothes she wore like armor, a thin pale scar through one eyebrow from a childhood nobody talked about, and a habit I learned to watch for before I understood it. When she was about to do something she could not take back, she went absolutely still and turned the heavy signet ring on her smallest finger, once, with her thumb. And I told her the truth, because no one had ever asked. "They tell me," I said, and she did not laugh. That was the beginning of the only season of my life I would not trade. It did not look like anything. At first, it looked like an heir who began, against every rule that says the great house and the trade door do not mix, to come down to wherever I was working, the conservatory, the cold cutting room, the marquee at midnight, and stand at my shoulder while I built things out of dying flowers, and not say very much, just watch me listen. No one with a name had ever, in my whole life, decided that the feeling behind a flower girl's sternum was worth standing in a cold cutting room at midnight to watch. She made me real by paying attention. I did not have a word for what that did to me. I have one now, and it is the word I spent the whole season refusing to think, and then could not unthink, and then was carrying, in the most literal way a woman can carry a word. By the time it all came apart, there was a particular night, early in the season, that told me what kind of alpha she really was under the cold. I was rebuilding a whole table arrangement at 1 in the morning because the heat of the day's party had turned it, and she had not gone up to bed. She had come down to the cutting room and was sitting on an upturned crate at the end of my bench, with an untouched glass of something expensive, watching me work. And she said, out of nowhere, looking at the flowers and not at me, "Nobody in this house has ever once asked me what I want." And I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was to put a flower in her hand. A single overblown garden rose I was about to throw out. A flower past its best that no bride would ever have wanted. And she held it the way you hold a thing you have decided about. And she did not throw it out. And I understood that the coldest heir in the country was a woman who had been spent her whole life and had never, not once, been given a single thing simply because someone wanted her to have it. I gave her a dying rose because I wanted her to have it. She kept it. I found it months later pressed flat in a book in the cold room the night before I left. I should tell you the truth about what it was between us that season, because I have promised you the truth, and the not saying is the whole of me. It started as attention, and for a woman who has been invisible her whole life, attention from the one person who refuses to look away is a more dangerous thing than any touch. We talked at first, only of flowers, but she learned the way I take my tea and started leaving it on the cold room shelf without a word, and I learned that the scar through her eyebrow came from the night her father died, and the house closed over her like a fist when she was 16. And I understood, the night she told me that, flatly, looking at the dark garden and not at me, that the coldest air in the country had been frozen on purpose by people a long time ago, the same way I had folded myself down small, that we were the same wound facing opposite directions. I had made mine quiet. She had let hers make her cold. And in the warm dark of that cutting room, over a season, we recognized each other the way you only ever recognize the thing you had given up hoping was real. I have to tell you the whole of what made Aveline Harcourt cold, because it is the thing that made her, 3 years later, walk away from an altar. Her father died when she was 16, the last Harcourt who had loved her without an invoice attached, and the house closed over her that same winter like a fist, because a 16-year-old heir is not a child to a dying house. She is an asset that has come of age. They taught her, patiently, over years, that her wants were a liability, and her acceptances were a duty, that a Harcourt's heart was the house's to spend, that the warm things were for other people, and her job was to be the cold name that paid for them. And she had learned it so well that by the time she crouched in a garden border at 6 in the morning and asked a flower girl how she knew which ones to cut, she genuinely did not know that a person was allowed to want something just because they wanted it. That is what I was to her, before I was anything else. Not romance at first, but the first evidence in 20 years that wanting was even permitted. I have thought a great deal, in 3 years, about how dangerous it is to be the first warm thing a starved person is ever handed. It is the kind of thing a house will go to great lengths to take away. There was a night it became what it was, and I will not tell you all of it here, because some of it is mine and some of it is on the other side of a paywall. But I will tell you the shape. It was late, and the work was done, and I was tying off the last bunch with my grandmother's green ribbon, and she reached out and stopped my hands with her own, the first time she had ever touched me, and she turned the ribbon over in my fingers and asked me what flower I would choose for myself, if a flower could be for me. And I could not answer, because no one had ever once, in 23 years, suggested that anything beautiful might be for me. That was the night the season became the thing I had been refusing to name. For a few warm weeks, I let myself believe, against everything my whole life had taught me, that a flower might be for me after all. I should have known better. A poor girl who lets herself be chosen by a great house is only ever borrowing the warmth. The house always, always calls the loan. For a few weeks, though, before the loan came due, I let myself live inside the borrowed warmth as though it were mine, and I will not apologize for it, because it was the only season of my life I have ever been warm. She would come to wherever I was working, and we would not even speak, sometimes for an hour. She would just sit with the dying rose she would not throw out and watch me read the flowers, and I would feel, for the length of a stem, like a woman somebody had chosen on purpose. She told me small sideways things she had never told anyone. She asked me, once, what I would name a daughter, if I ever had one, and I said posy because it is a word that means a small bunch of flowers tied with a ribbon, the cheapest beautiful thing my grandmother ever made, and Aveline said it back to me quietly, posy, like she was pressing it flat in a book to keep. I did not know that night that I would name a real daughter that exact word 8 months later, alone, in a different city, and that she would not be there to hear it. The warmth was real. That is the cruel part. It was real, and it was borrowed, and the house was already drawing up the papers to take it back. The house called it in the way great houses always do. Not cruelly, which would have been easier, but with a balance sheet. The Harcourts were not what their name still pretended. The money was old and almost gone, and the only thing that could save the house was a merger, and the only currency a dying house has left is the marriage of its heir. They had found Aveline a match, Marguerite Vell, of a family with new money and an old appetite for an old name, and the engagement was arranged over Aveline's head in a single afternoon, the way you sign for a delivery. I was not told. I was not anything to be told. I found out the way the invisible always find out. I was in the cold room building the flowers for the engagement party. The engagement party. Before anyone thought to mention to the florist whose engagement it was. I built that arch with my grandmother's ribbon and my own 2 hands, and a thing breaking behind my sternum that no flower had ever taught me to read. And I understood, kneeling in the petals, that I had been the warmth a frozen woman borrowed for 1 season, and that the loan was now due, and that I had nothing, no name, no claim, nothing the house would even have to refuse. I should tell you about the dowager properly here because she arranged all of it, and she did it without ever once raising her voice. And that is the most frightening kind of person there is. Honoria Harcourt had run the house from behind the heir for 40 years, and she did not see people. She saw line items, assets and liabilities and things to be managed. And she had looked at her granddaughter's strange new warmth, at the florist who kept being where the heir was, and she had done the arithmetic and found the answer unacceptable, the way she found everything unacceptable that she had not chosen. She did not forbid me. Forbidding gives a thing weight. She simply made me disappear the way she made everything disappear. A word to the planner who hired me, a quiet end to the bookings, a sense that doors that had been ajar were now closed, and a single conversation with her granddaughter that I was not in the room for and never learned the shape of, after which Aveline was engaged to Marguerite Vell and did not come down to the cutting room anymore. She managed me out of her granddaughter's life like a clerk closing an account. She did not know when she did it that the account was not empty. That is the one thing the careful woman failed to count, and it walked into her cathedral 3 years later on my hip. And then I learned the other thing, the thing that turned a heartbreak into a 3-year silence, the thing that is the whole engine of this story. I was 11 days late the day I knelt in those petals. I did not know it yet. Standing there, building the arch for the woman the house had chosen instead of me. But within the week, I knew, with the same certainty I know a flower, that I was carrying Aveline Harcourt's child. And I made the decision that built the next 3 years of my life. And I want to set it down plainly because it is the heart of me. I did not tell her. I could have. A part of me will wonder forever what would have happened if I had walked into that cold house and said it. But I knew exactly what I was. The florist, the trade door girl, the season's borrowed warmth. And I knew exactly what my child would become inside that balance sheet. Not a daughter, but a problem with a price, a thing the house would manage. The dowager would have written me a check and an agreement and made my child into the house's secret to keep. And I would rather have raised her alone in 2 cold rooms, poor and proud and free, than let her be the thing the Harcourts had to manage. So I did the one thing the invisible girl is never expected to have the nerve to do. I took my grandmother's shears and her green ribbon and what dignity I had left. And I disappeared. And I let the coldest house in the country close over the empty place where I had been. And I never told the woman I loved that she had a daughter. I have turned that decision over 10,000 times in 3 years, in the bad hours. And I want to be honest that I do not know, even now, if it was brave or only frightened wearing Brave's coat. There's a version of me that walked into the cold house and said the true thing and let it cost what it cost. But I knew the house by then better than the house knew itself. I knew that a child of the heirs born to a trade door girl would not be a daughter to the dowager. She would be a problem with a solution, and the solution would be money and silence and a name on a document. My child folded down into the house's secret to be managed for the rest of her life. And I knew what it does to a person to grow up as a thing that is being managed, because I had grown up as a thing that was overlooked, which is the same cold from a different direction. So I chose the cold I knew. I chose 2 rooms, and red invoices, and freedom over a warm cage with my daughter's name redacted from it. Maybe I was wrong, but I was early, the way I am always early. And what I felt coming was a gilded erasure, and I would not let them do it to her. Whatever else I have been, invisible, overlooked, swept aside, I was, in that one decision, the only thing standing between my daughter and a house that would have loved her like a liability. I want you to understand what those 3 years actually were, because the story makes me sound braver than the mornings felt. I had a baby in 2 rented rooms and a flower shop held together with goodwill and unpaid invoices. And I was tired in a way that lives in your bones. And there were nights I counted coins on the kitchen table and could not make them be enough. And I did it anyway, because she was mine. The truest thing I have ever made, more than any arch of roses. A small, fierce, copper-haired girl I named Posy, who had my hair and a pair of grave gray eyes that were not mine and that I could not look at, some mornings, without having to sit down. I built other people's weddings to keep us. I became quietly the best uncredited hands in the city, slipping in the trade door of the grandest rooms and out before the guests, building beauty I could never afford to stand inside. And I told myself every single time that being early and invisible and free was better than being warm and owned. Most days I even believed it. Remember Posy? She is the whole reason, and she is the thing that walked at 3 years old into the one place in the world I had spent 3 years keeping her away from. Posy grew the way flowers grow when you are not watching, all at once and then overnight. And she grew with the gift in her, I think, though it is too early to say. She would stand very still in the shop and watch a bucket of stems the way her mother used to go still before a thing she could not take back. That same grave attention, those same gray eyes. She had a drawing she made me, around the time she turned 3, in wax crayon, of 3 figures holding hands, a tall one, a middle one, and a small one. And when I asked her who they were, she said us, though there were only ever 2 of us, and I pinned it to the cold room wall and never once let myself finish the thought it started. She slept with my grandmother's green ribbon tied around her wrist because she would not settle without it. The cheapest beautiful thing, passed down a 3rd time. I would look at her some nights and feel the old terror and the old wonder at once that I had made, out of one borrowed warm season, the truest thing in my life, and that she carried in her gray eyes a whole cold house that did not know she existed. I thought I could keep those 2 facts in 2 separate rooms forever. The cathedral is where the wall between them came down. There was a night in the 2nd year I have never told anyone about, and I will tell you, because it is the truest measure of what those years cost and what they were worth. Posy ran a fever, the kind that comes up fast in a small child and empties all the reason out of you. And I sat up with her on the bathroom floor of our 2 rooms, with the tap running cool because I could not afford for it to be anything more serious than a fever, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, rocking my burning daughter under a buzzing light, I came as close as I ever came to picking up the telephone and calling the cold house and saying the true thing. Because there is a particular hour when your child is sick and you are alone and poor, when pride looks exactly like what it is, which is a luxury, and the warm cage starts to look like simple shelter. I did not call. The fever broke by dawn, the way they do. But I sat there in the gray light with my sleeping girl finally cool against me, and I understood that I had chosen this, every cold floor of it, and that choosing it again every single hard night on purpose, with no one watching and no one to thank me, was the only kind of brave I was ever going to get to be. Nobody gives you a medal for the weddings you don't ruin or the calls you don't make. You just do it, in the dark, and call it being a mother. Because the city is smaller than grief, and the trade has a long memory, and the best flowers in it are still, 3 years on, built by a woman nobody photographs. The commission came through a planner, the way the big ones do, anonymous and enormous. A society wedding at the old cathedral, the budget of a small house, the kind of job that comes once and changes a shop's whole year. I needed it the way you need air when you have a child and a stack of red invoices. And I took it before I knew whose it was, because that is the arithmetic of staying alive. And the planner did what planners do and kept the names close. I did not learn whose wedding I had agreed to build until I was already in too deep to walk away without ruin. Until I was standing in the cold vestry of that cathedral with the order sheet in my hand and saw, at last, the name at the top of it, Harcourt. I was going to build, with my grandmother's shears and my own 2 hands, the wedding of the woman who had let her family sign me away. Her wedding to somebody else. And I was going to do it for the money because I had a daughter, and pride is a luxury a mother counts out in coins. I almost ran. I want to be honest about that. I stood in that cold vestry with the order sheet shaking in my hand, and every instinct I had ever built for survival screaming at me to throw it down and run back to my 2 rooms and my anonymous safe small life. And then I thought about the number on the contract and the red invoices and Posey's shoes that were already too small, and I understood that I did not have the luxury of a broken heart, that the woman who breaks you does not get to also break your livelihood, that I could take her money and build her a beautiful day and walk out the trade door 3 years even, and she would never even know the florist's name. So I stayed. I told myself it was only flowers. I told myself I could build a wedding for a woman I had loved and feel nothing. The way you can hold your breath if you only have to do it for a little while. I was wrong about how long I would have to hold it. And I was wrong about the little girl I could not leave at home, because there was no one to leave her with. And that, in the end, is the whole hinge of the story. I had to bring my daughter to her mother's wedding. The dread of those 3 setup nights was a particular flavor I had never tasted before. Not grief exactly, which I knew well, but the slow, grinding nearness of the thing you have spent years arranging your whole life to avoid. Every evening, I let myself into that cold cathedral through the trade door with Posey half asleep on my shoulder. And every evening, I told myself the same lie, that Aveline would be busy with the rehearsal and the dinners and the 100 duties of a society groom, that our paths would never cross in a building that size, that I would be gone before she ever walked her own aisle. And it almost held. I saw her only once in those 3 nights, from the dark of the side chapel, across the whole length of the nave, in conversation with the planner, standing the way she had always stood, the still point a room arranged itself around. And I pressed myself back into the shadow with my sleeping daughter, and my heart going like a cut stem in water, and she did not see us. And I told myself that was a mercy. I know now it was only a delay. You cannot dress a woman's wedding in 10,000 flowers and expect the flowers not to tell her the truth. They always tell the truth. It is the one thing they cannot help. I built the most beautiful wedding of my life for the woman who broke me. I want you to know that I did not do it small or bitter. I did it the way my grandmother taught me, with everything I had, because the flowers had not done anything to me, and they deserved my whole heart even when the day did not. 3 nights I worked in that cold cathedral, alone after the vergers locked up, with Posey asleep in a nest of moving blankets in the side chapel, where the old verger let me keep her. And I dressed 10,000 stems down that long stone aisle, white roses and ivory peonies and trailing jasmine and the deep green I tie everything with. And I read every single bloom, And I gave that cathedral a day it did not deserve to be the setting for. And on the third night, kneeling at the chancel step with my hands full of my grandmother's green ribbon and my sleeping daughter 20 feet away, I let myself feel, for 1 minute, the thing I had not let myself feel in 3 years, that I was about to stand in a church and watch the woman I loved marry somebody else over a daughter she did not know she had, and that I was going to do it in silence, the way I had done everything, early and invisible and unbelieved. I thought that was the worst it could get. I had no idea yet that the worst night and the first night of my real life were going to be the same night. I want you to see what I built, because I have never been able to make anyone understand that it was the best work of my life and the worst night of it at the same time. And both of those are true. I dressed that whole long aisle in white, old garden roses with their generous open faces, ivory peonies cut at exactly the hour I knew they would be perfect by noon on the wedding day, and not an hour sooner, ropes of jasmine down the pew ends that would release their scent only when the warmth of 300 bodies woke them, a great breaking wave of bloom over the chancel arch built on a hidden frame I tied with my grandmother's green ribbon underneath, where no one would ever see it. Because the inside is the true part, and you build the inside for yourself. I read every single stem. I gave that cathedral the most honest flowers I've ever cut, and I did it for a wedding that was a lie, a merger dressed as a marriage, a heart sold as a line item. And the whole time, kneeling in that beauty in the cold dark, I kept thinking of the one thing my grandmother swore was true, that flowers don't lie about what they're for. I was filling a church with 10,000 honest flowers for a dishonest day, and somewhere underneath the dread, in the place behind my sternum that always knows first, I think part of me already understood that the flowers were going to tell the truth, even if I never did. They always do. It is the one thing they cannot help. I have to tell you about the dowager, because she is the cold hand behind all of it, and her calm is the most frightening thing in this story. Honoria Harcourt, Aveline's grandmother, the chair of everything, the one who had run the house from behind the heir for 40 years, found me on the second night, in the cathedral, because a woman like that always knows when a loose thread has come back into the weave. She did not raise her voice. Women like her never have to. She knew exactly who I was. She was the one who had quietly made me disappear 3 years before, and she had not forgotten the florist. And she had certainly not failed to notice the copper-haired child asleep in the side chapel. Remember her calm. It is the engine of everything that was about to come apart in front of 300 people. And I want to tell you about the second time I almost signed, because I have spent my life being honest about my own smallness. I had my hand on her pen. The number would have cleared the red invoices and bought Posey a year of not counting coins, and every instinct I had ever built for surviving as a disposable woman screamed at me to take the clean exit and vanish again, the way I had vanished before, the way I had been quiet my whole life. And then I looked 20 feet across the dark cathedral to where my daughter slept in a nest of blankets with my grandmother's green ribbon tied around her wrist because she would not sleep without it. And I thought about a bloom always knowing who it is for. And I understood that I had run once to keep my child from being a thing the house could buy, and that signing this check would be the same surrender wearing a kinder coat. I had been early my whole life about everything except this, so I put the pen down. I did not take the dowager's money. I told the coldest woman in the country to keep her folder, and I kept my daughter and my grandmother's shears in the truth, with no name and no claim and no one in the world to say it with me, on the night before the woman I loved was going to marry somebody else. The old verger is the reason I made it to the morning, and I have to set him down, because every story like mine has one person who refuses to be complicit. Tomas had kept the cathedral garden for 40 years. He had bought flowers from my grandmother's stall when he was a young man and she a young woman. And he knew her shears the moment he saw them in my apron. And he had let me keep Posey in the side chapel without a word, and brought her warm milk and brought me strong tea in the cold hours. He found me on the chancel step after the dowager swept out, with the rejected folder still lying there and my hands shaking. and he sat down beside me on the cold stone, an old man who had married and buried half the city under that roof. And he did not tell me it would be all right, because he had been a verger too long to lie. He let the quiet sit, and then he asked me the only question that mattered, the one I think he had been carrying for me since he recognized my grandmother's shears. "You have to decide something tonight, girl, and only you can." I did not have an answer, but I stopped on that cold step, being a woman the worst night was happening to, and started being a woman who had a decision in her hands. The wedding day came up gold and cruel and beautiful, the kind of high clear morning that makes even an old cathedral look like a promise. They had dressed the city's grandest for it, 300 of the oldest and newest names under one ancient roof. The candles lit down the whole long nave, the great bells ready, and at the heart of it, the wedding I had built with my own 2 hands, 10,000 flowers holding their breath down a stone aisle. And I did my job. I want you to understand that I meant to do my job and vanish. I was in my work apron at the back by the trade door, with Posy on my hip because there was nowhere else for her to be, ready to slip out the moment the bride stepped off and the doors closed, to take my daughter home and never tell her whose wedding she had slept through. That was the plan. The plan was to be invisible one last time. And then the great doors opened, and the bride came in on a tide of my white roses. And at the far end of that aisle, turning to watch her come, in a dark suit with a Harcourt signet on her smallest finger, was Aveline Harcourt. And 3 years in a whole ocean of silence stood up in me at once. And Posy, who was 3 and tired and did not understand churches, lifted her copper head off my shoulder to see what everyone was looking at. I will tell you exactly how it happened, because it is the part where everything I am got decided, and it took less than a minute, and it took 3 years. Aveline was at the altar. The vows had begun. The old words, the ones the cathedral was built to carry. And somewhere in the middle of them, she looked, the way you do, past her own bride and down the long aisle toward the back of the church, toward the trade door, toward the only part of the room that was still moving. And she saw a florist in a work apron she had not let herself look at all week, with a child on her hip. And she saw the child. She saw the copper hair that was mine. And then the candlelight caught the child's face. And she saw the gray eyes that were not mine, that were her father's, that were the dowager's, that were her own. And I watched, across 300 people and 10,000 flowers, the coldest woman in the country go absolutely still and turn the signet ring on her smallest finger, once, with her thumb. And I knew that look. It was the look she got the second before she did a thing she could not take back. What happened in the next few seconds happened very slowly, the way the most important seconds always do. The priest's voice went on with the old words, not yet understanding that the wedding had already ended. Marguerite, at the altar, followed the line of her groom's stare down the long aisle, and her face began to change. 300 guests who had been watching the bride began to turn, one by one, the way a field turns in a wind, toward whatever the heir was looking at, toward the back of the church, toward the trade door, toward a florist in a work apron and a copper-haired child nobody could place. And the dowager rose from the front pew with 40 years of control on her face, cracking into something I had never seen there before, which was fear, because Honoria Harcourt had just done the arithmetic faster than anyone, had just counted the one thing she had failed to count 3 years before, and understood, a half second before the rest of the room, that the account had never been empty. For one long breath, the whole cathedral hung there, 300 people and 10,000 of my flowers, and a child with her father's eyes, everything balanced on the edge of a thing nobody could take back. And then Aveline took the first step down off the chancel, toward us, and the breath let go. She stopped the wedding, not with a scene. Aveline Harcourt never did anything with a scene, but by simply, in the middle of her own vows, turning her back on her bride and the priest, and 40 years of her family's careful planning and walking, down the chancel steps, down the long aisle I had dressed for her in the dark, past 300 rising, murmuring guests, past her grandmother coming to her feet with 40 years of control finally cracking on her face, toward the back of the church, toward the trade door, toward the florist and the child. And the whole cathedral turned to follow her walk. And for the first time in my entire life, I could not make myself invisible, because the one person who had always seen me was crossing a church to do it again in front of everyone. She stopped in front of us. She looked at Posey for a long time. I could have lied. 3 years of lying had made me good at it, and the lie was right there. Easy, kind, ruinous. But Posey, who did not understand any of it, who only understood that a tall, still woman was looking at her the way no one ever had, reached out one small hand toward the gray-eyed stranger, the way children reach toward the thing they recognize before they have words for it. And that small hand did what 3 years of my silence had not been able to do. I felt the lie go out of me, and I said the truest sentence I have ever said in a church in front of 300 people holding our daughter. She's yours. She's always been yours. And Aveline Harcourt, the coldest heir of the coldest house in the country, who had not, by the cabin crew's private legend, been seen surprised in a decade, went down, not fainting, down onto one knee, on the worn stone of that aisle, in her wedding suit, to be at eye level with a 3-year-old, her gray eyes spilling over, looking at the daughter she had not known she had until 90 seconds before. And then she did the thing that turned my gray 3 years inside out, and she did it loud, on purpose, in front of every name her house had spent 40 years bowing to. She took Posey's small, reaching hand in hers, and she stood, and she turned to face the cathedral, her abandoned bride, her white-faced grandmother, 300 of the most important people in the country, and the priest still holding the open book. And she said it in the even voice that never had to be raised. "There will be no wedding. This is my daughter. And this," she reached out and took my hand, the hand that had built every flower in that church, the way she had once stopped my hands across a cutting table. "This is the woman I should have refused to give up 3 years ago, when I let you teach me that a Harcourt's heart is a thing the house gets to spend." And then she pushed the collar of my work apron aside with 2 fingers and pressed her mouth to the side of my throat. There, in the cathedral, in front of everyone. And when she straightened, there was a bond mark where her mouth had been. And the whole nave made the sound a room makes when a careful sentry cracks all at once. It was not a scandal. That is the thing the dowager never understood about the light, and it is why she lost. She had built her whole 40 years on the certainty that the truth was a thing you managed in the dark, that a florist could be paid off, a child made into a secret, an heir's heart spent like a line item, because no one was ever truly looking when it mattered. And Aveline had simply taken the whole of it into the candlelight of that cathedral, in front of every name that mattered, and once it was in the light, there was nothing left to manage. You cannot pay off a woman the heir has claimed at her own altar. You cannot disappear a child 300 people have just watched her father kneel to. The dowager stood in the wreck of her careful wedding with 40 years of control gone from her face, and the merger she had sold the heir's life for died on the cathedral floor with everyone watching. And there was not one single thing her calm could do about it, because the loose thread she had tried to cut 3 years before had just walked back in and unraveled the whole cloth in the light. I want to tell you about the quietest second of the whole loud day, because it is the one I keep. After the mark, after the gasp, after the careful sentry came down, before anyone moved, before the dowager found her voice, before the cathedral remembered how to be a crowd, Aveline simply stood there with our daughter's hand in one of hers and mine in the other, and she let out a breath. One long breath, the kind you have been holding for 3 years without knowing it, the kind that empties a whole frozen house out of a person at last. And Posey, who did not understand a single thing that had happened, who only understood that the tall, gray-eyed woman was no longer a stranger, leaned her copper head against Aveline's leg, the way she leaned it against me when she was tired, trusting and total, the way only a small child can give a person the entire weight of themselves. And I watched the coldest woman in the country feel her own daughter lean on her for the first time. And I watched the last of the winter go out of her, right there, in the wreck of her own wedding, in front of everyone. And I understood that the flowers had been right all along. Some things know exactly who they are for. We had just spent 3 years being the only 2 people in the country who refused to read them. The bride, Marguerite, who had been sold an old name and not told it came with a season of someone else's flowers and a copper-haired secret, left the way the wronged should be allowed to leave, with her head up. And I have never once been able to be glad about her part in it, because she was a line item too, in her way, in the dowager's arithmetic. And the only person in that cathedral who came out of it free was the one nobody had planned for, the florist in the work apron, holding the hand of the woman who finally, in front of everyone, refused to give her up. They cleared the church slowly, the way people leave a thing they will be telling their grandchildren about. And Aveline Harcourt stood in the middle of 10,000 of my flowers with our daughter on her arm, and my hand in hers. And for the first time since a garden border at 6 in the morning 3 years before, the coldest woman in the country looked warm. I think about the old verger, Tomas, who was the reason any of it got to happen in the light at all. When the church had emptied and the bells had not rung, and the wreck of the dowager's careful century lay around us in white roses, he came out from the vestry where he had quietly watched the whole thing, and he did not say anything grand. And I understood, standing in the ruin of a wedding I had built, and a silence I had finally broken, that the question he had asked me on the cold chancel step the night before had answered itself. It had not been the worst night of my life. It had been the first night of the one my gran actually raised me for. He married Aveline and me himself, a year later, in that same cathedral, with flowers I built in the daylight, and signed my name too. And Posey carried the rings on a length of faded green ribbon. And there was no one in the world left who got to call any of us a line item. I want to tell you what the next year was, because the altar is where the story turns, but it is not where the love is. The love is in the year after, the ordinary one. Aveline walked away from the merger and let the old house be as poor as it actually was. And it turned out a name is lighter to carry once you stop pretending it is gold. And she learned to be a parent from a standing start, clumsy and serious, and entirely present, kneeling to offer Posey her open hand before the child even had to ask, the way she had once learned to wait in a cold room for a flower to tell me the truth. I kept my shop. I kept my grandmother's shears and her green ribbon, but now my name is on the window, and I build flowers in the daylight at last, photographed beside my own work, no longer the girl who comes in the trade door and leaves before the guests. And Posey grew up with 2 mothers and a grandmother's ribbon she still will not sleep without, and a pair of grave gray eyes that I can finally look at in the morning without having to sit down. Because the thing they came from is sitting at my kitchen table now, drinking tea I leave out without a word, because my grandmother was right in the end, about the only thing that ever mattered. Flowers don't lie about what they're for. A bloom always knows who it's for. Your only job is to be listening when it tells you. I had spent my whole life being early and being right and being nobody, and learning that the 3 were the same woman, and folding myself down small so that no one would ever be able to spend me. And then, one cold morning in a garden border, an alpha with a scar through her eyebrow crouched down in the wet and asked a flower girl how she knew which ones to cut, and listened to the answer. And 3 years and 1 ruined wedding later, at the altar of a marriage I had built with my own 2 hands, she finally stood up in front of everyone and said the thing the flowers had been trying to tell us both the whole time, that some things know exactly who they are for, that I was always for her, and that no house ever again gets to spend what was never theirs to sell.